get started here. Thank you all for coming out. This is Praxis's last main event of the semester. And just a quick note, we will have next Monday a sort of bonus event. Kadeem and Savannah Norre are current graduate students of the Harvard Kennedy School. They're Hillsdale alum, and they'll be coming to speak about what graduate school in econ is like and what economic research is all about. So if you're interested in that, come out to...
Can you point out that they're at Harvard?
Yes, they're at the Harvard Kennedy School doing PhDs in public policy with the economics track right now. So they know what econ grad school is all about, and if you're interested in that as a future career option, I'd highly recommend you come out. But our event for this evening is with Boudreaux, and we'll get started with that. Dr. Donald Boudreaux is a senior fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and a professor of economics and former department chair at George Mason University. He holds the Martha and Nelson Gretschel Chair for the Study of Free Market Capitalism at the Mercatus Center. Dr. Boudreaux specializes in globalization and trade, law and econ, and antitrust economics. He is committed to making economics more accessible to a wider audience, and he has lectured across the United States, Canada, Latin America, and Europe on a wide variety of topics, including antitrust law and international trade. He is the author of the books Globalization and The Essential Hayek. His articles have appeared in such publications as the Wall Street Journal and U.S. News and World Report, as well as numerous scholarly journals. He blogs at Cafe Hayek and for 15 years wrote a regular column on economics for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. Previously, Dr. Boudreaux was president for the Foundation for Economic Education and an associate professor of legal studies and economics at Clemson University. He also serves as an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Dr. Boudreaux earned a PhD in economics from Auburn University and a law degree from the University of Virginia. Dr. Boudreaux's favorite economists, other than Hayek, are Armin Alchian, Harold Dimsetz, and Julian Simon. So please welcome Donald Boudreaux.
Thanks, Alex. It's always a pleasure to be at Hillsdale. As you know, this is a special place. George Mason, where I am, is a special place. I think it's losing some of its specialness, not in my department, but it's a big state university. Hillsdale, I think, is going to remain ever true to what it's always been. So thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be back. This is probably at least my sixth time in Hillsdale over the years. See friends, Charlie, hi. So it's true, my specialties lately have been on trade policy, but over the past 2 years I've become obsessed with the end of civilization, or COVID, as it's now called. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about COVID. So suppose, let me give you a couple scenarios. Suppose we wake up tomorrow morning and we get news from a credible source. A gigantic meteor is heading to Earth, and this meteor is definitely going to hit. It's definitely, without a doubt, when it hits, it's going to destroy all life on the planet. It's basically going to pulverize the Earth. It's going to hit in about 3 months' time. No question that if it hits, this is going to be the result. And there's a consensus on this. No credible scientist or pundit disagrees. Rocket scientists are also agreed that there's a good chance we could build a rocket and send that rocket to intercept the meteor. And if we hit it just right, it destroys the meteor and we save all life on Earth. But the only way to build this rocket is we have to basically confiscate all wealth from everyone on Earth. We have to give government unlimited power to use all resources and all human effort to build a rocket. Now, if that's the case, how would you feel about that? I mean, suppose that is the news, and there's no dissent. I'm a lifelong libertarian. I suspect that under that circumstance, even I would say, there's not much value in talking about public choice economics or quoting from Ludwig von Mises and Bill Buckley about the dangers of government. Life's going to be destroyed in 3 months. We have no choice but to take the risk and let government commandeer us all in order to save life on Earth. That's one scenario, called the doomsday meteor scenario. Here's another scenario. You wake up, equally valid news source, a meteor is headed to Earth. There's a 0.05% chance it's going to hit. not much, but possibly. And if it does hit, it's probably not going to cause any damage because it's most likely going to land in the ocean. But even if it doesn't land in the ocean, it hits land, the upper estimate of the number of lives that will be lost by this meteor, if it does hit land, is 100. So what would you want to do in that circumstance? I think even the most enthusiastic proponent of government intervention would probably say, there's probably not much point doing anything. The risk here is pretty small. 100 people can die, that's true, but that's a really tiny risk. So here are two scenarios. But where does COVID fit in between the doomsday meteor scenario and the nothing burger meteor scenario? I think it's somewhere in between. But I want to argue, or one part of my argument is that the way the world has reacted over the past 2 years is if COVID is much closer to the doomsday meteor scenario than to the nothing burger scenario. I can't understand the way humanity, most of humanity, has reacted to COVID without believing that a lot of people truly did believe that COVID posed an existential threat to life on Earth as we know it. So let me be clear. I don't believe that COVID is not dangerous. I'm going to give you some, this is not a talk about statistics, I'm going to give you a handful that I think are relevant at the moment. I don't believe that it is no more dangerous than the flu to any randomly chosen person. I think by a lot of measures, COVID is in fact a real danger. The SARS-CoV-2 virus was indeed more dangerous than the typical pathogen, is more dangerous than the typical pathogen that we humans regularly encounter. But I do deny that this danger rose to an existential threat against humanity. So again, I don't want to talk a lot about facts, but I want to state at least some facts that I think are plausibly enough established facts as the basis for my remarks tonight. And in the context of the remarks, I hope to also engage in what I enjoy doing most, is teaching some economics. Although I'm at Hillsdale, maybe I don't have to do that, but I'm doing it anyway. Let me just give you two basic facts about COVID that I think are relevant. One is a fact about its infection fatality rate, the so-called IFR. The Stanford Stanford scientist, he's a data scientist, I'm not sure exactly what his field is, but he's one of the most cited scientists in the world, I understand. John Ioannidis, maybe. He did a number of studies of the COVID IFR. And a study published in early 2021, so he's looking at COVID just until the time, just before vaccinations became available. He found that before vaccinations began, the global median COVID-19 infection fatality rate was 0.27%. Now this figure means that if you pop down randomly anywhere on Earth, and you locate randomly 1,000 individuals who are infected with COVID, infected, not necessarily suffering symptoms, but infected with COVID, you test them and you get a correct positive test. This means that of these 1,000 randomly selected individuals who are infected, between 2 and 3 of them are going to die of COVID. But of course, COVID did not and does not strike randomly, neither geographically nor demographically. Ioannidis divided the world into 3 groups: countries with COVID mortality rates less than the global average, which at the time was 118 deaths per million people; countries with COVID mortality rates between 118 and 500 million; and countries with COVID mortality rates higher than 500 million, 500 per million. For the first group, Ioannidis found that the infection fatality rate was 0.09%. For the second, it was 0.20%. For the third, it was 0.57%. So in other words, for countries in which COVID was the most lethal, among 1,000 randomly chosen infected people, COVID killed between 5 and 6 of those 1,000 people. That's not an insignificant number, but it's not doomsday. these are people who are infected. These are not just randomly chosen people. These are people who are infected. And remember also, these numbers were before vaccinations, before lots of natural immunity was acquired, and before the far less lethal Omicron variant and its new variant that's around now. The second fact, which I think is even more important that I want to base my remarks on, and we knew this fact as early as March of 2020. There's an op-ed in the New York Times in, I think, March 20th, 2020, by a Yale physician that explicitly mentions this fact. This fact is that COVID reserves, you all know this, but I'll mention it. COVID reserves its dangers overwhelmingly for the very old. Ioannidis found that in people younger than 70 years old, globally, the global median infection fatality rate was 0.05% on average. In children and young adults, COVID's danger is close to zero. Now again, my talk here isn't about COVID statistics, but these can't be avoided altogether. So let me just give you one more set of statistics that I dug up yesterday off of the CDC's site. I've been following this page since COVID pretty much began, and it was renewed just a few days ago. On the latest breakdown from the CDC on the age distribution of COVID fatalities in America. 93% of all deaths of and with, I'm not going to get into that issue, but that is an issue, of and with. It's kind of it's an art, how you classify someone's death. 93% of all deaths of or with COVID are of people 50 and older. 93%. In other words, 7% of COVID deaths are of people younger than 50. 74% of COVID deaths are of people 65 and older. And 26%, more than a quarter, of all COVID deaths, this is in America, are of people 85 and older. This is definitely a disease that's overwhelmingly dangerous only to old people. And it's dangerous to old people because old people have a lot of comorbidities. So it's not because they're old, it's because as we get old, our bodies become weaker and we become more susceptible to other diseases. And when our body has other diseases, COVID becomes more of a threat to that. When you're young, you don't have these other diseases, and so you're largely immune to COVID. The percentage of COVID deaths, by the way, of people under 30, if you look at all the people in America who've died of COVID from the beginning until just a few days ago in America, whether classified as dying of COVID or with COVID, under 30, the percentage of COVID deaths is 0.7. It's virtually nothing. It's virtually nothing. There are a lot of people in America under 30. Most of you are under 30. I myself am a few months older than that. Be a little careful. So while there's some disagreement about COVID's infection fatality rate, there is no disagreement about COVID's very distinct age profile. This disease is indeed one that's overwhelmingly dangerous to the old, and it's not much of a danger at all to the young. Now you might accuse me of stacking the deck in favor of my case. My case is opposed to lockdowns, that's where I'm going to, by relying on data from John Ioannidis, who from the very start kept saying that COVID is much less lethal than most officials asserted it to be. And as I just noted, you can find others, reputable scientists who have slightly different estimates of the infection fatality rate than Ioannidis, but you will find no disagreement, none, among scientists that COVID is overwhelmingly dangerous to the very old. But this disagreement itself over the infection fatality rate, the very fact that scientists disagree about the exact measurement of the infection fatality rate, just how serious is it even to the people who are most subject to be laid low by COVID, that disagreement itself is sufficient to fundamentally distinguish COVID from the doomsday meteor. One reason everyone will agree in the doomsday meteor example that I gave you a few moments ago, to turn over to government, even me, to turn over to government unprecedented powers, is that in constructing the example, I assume that there's a consensus on the reality and terrible dangers of the meteor, as well as on the best means of protection from it. If there's a consensus that we're all going to die in 3 months, and a consensus that the only way we can save us all from dying in 3 months is to give government a lot of power to build a rocket to hopefully intercept the meteor, then it's as we say now, it's a no-brainer. Well, okay, we have to do that, otherwise we'll all be dead. We won't be around 3.5 months from now debating political philosophy. Yet with COVID, there never was any such consensus, never. Although if you pay attention only to the mainstream media, listen only to CNN or PBS, you would never have known this fact. Many prominent public health officials from the start objected to lockdowns. No less importantly, as recently as October 2019, you can read the document, I'll send you, if you want, I'll send you the URL to it, you can find it, it's easy. As recently as October 2019, just before COVID, the World Health Organization, in a document devoted to pandemics, counseled against lockdowns. And so even if there was consensus about COVID's lethality, and further, even if COVID struck randomly, which it doesn't, across all age groups, the case for lockdowns was nevertheless questionable from the start. Without a consensus for using a measure as unprecedented as lockdowns, the burden of persuasion should have been on those who proposed lockdowns to make their case. And this burden should have been very heavy. Yet by March of 2020, the case for lockdowns was presented not only as if there was a scientific consensus for it, but also as if lockdowns were self-evidently the only reasonable means of protecting humanity from the virus. The burden of persuasion thus was, without much thought, thrust on those of us who opposed lockdowns. The thoughtlessness of this embrace of tyrannical powers and the maintenance of these powers after the initial period of surprise 2 years ago had passed is alone enough to allow us today, in 2022, to condemn, I think pretty strongly, the lockdowns as setting a terrible precedent. Let me bend over backwards to be generous. Let's stipulate that the first few months of COVID, so March 2020 through maybe June 2020, were so uncertain and scary that no serious blame can be justifiably cast on officials who imposed harsh measures and on bureaucrats and intellectuals who applauded these harsh measures. Yet by October 2020, more than a half year after COVID burst into our lungs and into our consciousness, enough information was known to make continued and further lockdowns wholly unjustified. It was in October of 2020 that Jay Bhattacharya of the Stanford Medical School, Martin Kulldorff of the Harvard Medical School, and Sunetra Gupta, a theoretical epidemiologist at the University of Oxford. You've heard of these places. These are fairly prominent places of higher learning. These are all acclaimed scientists. They wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. It's called the Great Barrington Declaration because it was written at the American Institute for Economic Research, which is located in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. In this document, these researchers call for focused protection of the vulnerable while letting human life go on normally. That is, as it went on up until the middle of March of 2020. Contrary to the hostile reaction that publication of this declaration immediately sparked, all this document did was to make a case for pursuing public health recommendations that were consensus until 2020. The Great Barrington Declaration did nothing other than put in modern American language, and for the COVID case, basically the recommendation that the World Health Organization promulgated in a much longer document in October of 2019, just 1 year earlier. And the case for doing so, the case for this focused protection, with COVID, it's especially strong because with COVID, the vulnerable are relatively easy to identify. They're very old people or very sick people. By October 2020, the evidence was indisputable that COVID poses a danger overwhelmingly only to old people. I can't say that enough. And almost none to young people. Again, in the US, about 26% of all COVID deaths were people 85 and older, with only a minuscule occurring among young people. So with COVID, identifying who protection should be focused on was fairly easy. But the reaction to the declaration, the Great Barrington Declaration, was hysterically over the top. From the moment it was released, it was subjected to all sorts of absurd accusations. We know, one, I'm not going to spend much time talking about, well, not spend much time talking about any of these, but one of the ones that you may have heard about through a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, we learned 4 or 5 months ago that Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, sent an email to Anthony Fauci. You may have heard of him. He's been in the news a lot lately. Sent an email to Anthony Fauci saying there's this great Barrington Declaration out there written by fringe epidemiologists, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford, all tenured, all highly acclaimed scientists. And so Francis Collins asked Anthony Fauci to get on the ball and make sure that a lot of effort is put in to squelching this great Barrington Declaration. We have to have a concerted effort to discredit the Declaration and to discredit its authors. This comes from the highest levels of government. Another accusation against the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration is that they advocated a let-it-rip strategy. This is how it was described in the New York Times. Let it rip. Well, these people just want to let it rip. It sounds kind of careless, right? Well, you want to save lives, you want to let it rip. Right? You're a good guy, you're an evil ogre. That's not what they were arguing at all. They weren't arguing to let it rip. They were saying, it's important to point out, I think, Jay Bhattacharya also has a PhD in economics. And so he understands that resources are scarce. And I don't think you need a PhD in economics to understand that resources are scarce, but it's an important thing to point out because a lot of people don't seem to grasp that fact. So if resources are scarce and we have a dangerous disease about, and it is a dangerous disease, we know it's affecting largely only very old people, rather than just locking the entire world down, why don't we think about this sensibly? Why don't we rationally try to husband these resources, what resources are at our disposal, and focus those on protecting the elderly, focus those on protecting the vulnerable, and letting life for the rest of us go on. That's not a let-it-rip strategy. That's a strategy saying, you are vulnerable, you are not, so we're going to protect you. We're not going to bother to protect you. It's up to you to protect you. Another accusation against the Great Barrington Declaration was that, this is one of my favorites, it's very intellectually sound, it was an ad hominem argument. Paul Krugman, the former economist who writes for the New York Times, had this in his column. He discovered that the American Institute for Economic Research had, a few years earlier, in 2018, received a small 5-figure grant from the Koch Foundation. It was like $16,500. AIER's endowment is over $28 million. And so this, I think AER got 2 similar grants from the Koch Foundation, roughly that same point. This is before COVID. So the natural conclusion is these are evil billionaires somehow wanting to let the virus rip to kill everybody because there's no better way to drum up business for your billionaire businesses than killing the world's population. I'm not sure how that works, but the ad hominem was you still see it. Another version of the ad hominem is that some of the then top employees of AIER, as it's called, used to work for Ron Paul. Ron Paul is not popular in some circles. Therefore, scientists who happen to write a declaration under the auspices of AIER cannot be trusted, and we have to dismiss their scientific recommendations because someone else who works at AIER, none of these people worked at AIER, someone who works at AIER once had an affiliation with a politician we don't like. This was what passes for intelligent argument in the COVID era. And finally, and this is the one I'm going to spend most time on, the final objection to the Great Barrington Declaration, and probably the most serious one, I mean, this is one that has most substance, is that focus protection is impractical. It's impractical. We don't know how to do it. Well, so I'm an economist, and the question is always, as compared to what? That's the ultimate I think, the ultimate economist, or it's a candidate for being the ultimate economist question. As compared to what? We don't know how to do it. It's impractical. Well, as compared to what? Of course, the relevant what in this case is lockdowns, the sledgehammer taken to the global economy, the issuing of stay-at-home orders and business closures whose end dates were uncertain, the granting to government powers unprecedented in peacetime to micromanage the private affairs of each and every person. Whatever the challenges of focusing protection on the vulnerable, these challenges must be compared to the challenges of dealing with the unprecedented closure of economic activity worldwide and halting social activities. However difficult it might be to figure out practically, how are we going to, these are 85-year-old people, they're especially vulnerable, where should we put them, what resources should we husband in order to reduce their prospects of suffering from COVID. Real challenges, of course, but is locking down the global economy practical? Is it a challenge? No one doubts that focusing protection on the vulnerable does indeed present real challenges. The authors of the Great Barrington Declaration mention this, they recognize it. But these are comparable, or are these comparable, to knowing how to deal with indefinite lockdowns of economic and social life as we know it? Think about that era. I mean, to me, it's just bizarre. You have 5-year-olds going to school through Zoom. We're playing sports events with cardboard cutouts in the stadium. Jobs were destroyed. I'm not sure exactly how bad it was here at Hillsdale. At George Mason, it was terrible. We were all teaching online. You can't teach online. You just can't. I mean, you can talk to a computer and other people can hear what you're saying. It's not teaching online. So the laptop class gets protected by the COVID lockdowns, and they get their, they can still get paid. The impracticalities of the lockdowns themselves, people seem to ignore. Well, we'll just shut the world down for however long it takes to wipe out COVID. A whole bunch of analogies occur to me. One is, I imagine a jetliner flying through the sky. 747 is going along pretty well. It's loaded with people. Everything's fine. And someone says, "Hey, let's see what happens if we turn off the engines for a few minutes." Right? Don't worry. Before we hit the ground, we'll turn them back on. Oh yeah, let's do that. Turn off the engines. Of course, the thing goes into a tailspin. Right? And then I guess it's possible with a skilled enough pilot and powerful enough engines, you turn it back on. Maybe you prevent a catastrophe. But that's kind of how I thought lockdowns were. Actually, I got to say, things turned out to be a little better than I thought, although I think the prices that we're going to pay are still largely in the future. I only have a little bit of time left. I want to tell you about one of my favorite economists. So Alex mentioned 3 of my favorites. He asked me in the car who they were. I'm going to tell you a 4th one, Ronald Coase. You're at Hillsdale, you probably heard of Ronald Coase. He was a Nobel Prize winner in 1991. By the way, economics is a great profession. Ronald Coase was born in 1910. He died in 2013. And he wrote his last book in 2012. You want to go into a profession which you can write a book at the age of 112. I mean, let's go 102. Anyway, Coase's most famous article, as you might know, was this 1960 article, The Problem of Social Cost. It's about what economists call externalities. The most important contribution of Coase, although it's one that even economists don't really appreciate, is that Coase pointed out that externalities are bilateral. It takes 2 to tango. It takes 2 to externality. And so let me give you 2 scenarios, just abstract scenarios. So suppose you're kept awake at night by your neighbor Tom practicing his tuba. Right? So what Coase says is, well, okay, Tom's playing his tuba is keeping you awake at night, but if you didn't live there, you wouldn't hear Tom's tuba. And so your actions are partly responsible for you being kept awake. Your choosing to live where you live is partly responsible for Tom's tuba playing, keeping you awake. If you go to the building manager and complain, and Tom is told to not practice his tuba at midnight, Tom is upset by that, and he's upset at you because you complain, but he couldn't be upset at you if he didn't live there. If he instead lived out in the middle of nowhere and practiced his tuba, no one would complain. The point of Costa's example is that when you have an externality, where one person's actions affect someone else, both of these parties have it within their power to adjust. And the question then is, who is the best adjuster? Which party should best adjust? So keep with this example of Tom playing the tuba. In the real world, as you know, suppose you live in an apartment and suddenly you got some new neighbor who's practicing his tuba at midnight. And this goes on for a few nights. You're not going to tolerate it. So you go to the building manager, Lou. You say, Lou, my neighbor is practicing his tuba at night. And so basically you go to court. In this case, it's an informal court. It's Lou, the property manager. And what Lou might listen to Tom's side of the story. And Tom might say, well, I'm a night person. And pretty much what Lou would say is, what Lou would tell Tom is, sorry, buddy, you don't practice your tuba at midnight, not in this building. Look, both of these activities are perfectly innocent. Sleeping is an innocent activity. Practicing a musical instrument, innocent activity. We have a conflict over a shared scarce resource, airspace. And the question is, what is the best way to settle that conflict? And the building manager is surely going to tell Tom not to play his tuba. Another scenario. Let's say instead, you rather than living where you live, you several months ago found a great deal on a new apartment. The price is just too unbelievably good price of this apartment. Unfortunately, it's attached to a tuba factory, and they practice it. They experiment with their tubas 24/7. And so you kept awake at night, and you complained to the court. What's the court going to tell you? You shouldn't have moved there. It's a tuba factory, for heaven's sake, and you should have known it. As to put it in Kosian language, the low-cost avoider in the first example is Tom. He should stop playing his tuba at midnight. The low-cost avoider in the second example is you. You shouldn't have moved there. And given that you did move there, rather than the tuba factory being forced to shut down, you should move to a different apartment. So what does this have to do with COVID? I think it's a way of motivating what the Great Barrington Declaration meant by focused protection. Each of us, when there's a respiratory disease about, we are polluters. We're like a factory. Factory emits sulfur dioxide. The government tells the factory shut down. I think that's how people thought. That's how the governments, a lot of people thought about human beings in the COVID era. We're all smokestacks. And how do we deal with smokestacks? Well, we tell the smokestack to stop it until the smokestack is no longer spewing out toxic materials. But especially because we know who is most vulnerable to COVID, I think there's a much easier solution, a much better solution, a much more ethical and economically efficient solution, and that is the focused protection solution. So here's an extreme example. So before, I'm not bragging here, but even before the Great Barrington Declaration was published in October of 2020, my friend Lyle Albaugh and I wrote 3 essays, quite coincidentally published by the American Institute for Economic Research. It's true, it's a coincidence. We didn't do it because we knew, at the time I had no idea that there'd be this thing called the Great Barrington Declaration when we were writing these essays. And what we identified in our essays, my friend Lyle and I, was something called we call it the individualized option. It's even more radical or even more precise, I think, than focused protection. I said, well, why are we shutting down all of human society? So here's an extreme example, but I think it makes a point. And I have the data. Let me share the data with you. Hazmat suits. So if you're really worried about COVID, you can wear a hazmat suit. I got the data here. I went on to industrialsafety.com. They sell hazmat suits, high quality ones, so I'm told, for $200 a piece. So to supply every man, woman, and child in America with a hazmat suit would cost just under $70 billion. But let's supply every man, woman, and child in America with two. One for Sunday, or in case one breaks. So we're up to $140 billion. And the hazmat suit is going to protect. If you're really worried about COVID, put the hazmat suit on. $140 billion is a tiny fraction, a minuscule fraction of the amount of money the government, just the US government alone, forget about state governments, forget about governments worldwide, forget about the non-governmental costs of the lockdowns. It's a tiny fraction of the cost. And so we proposed having the government dispense hazmat suits. The response is, that's ludicrous. That's ridiculous. No, that's so unrealistic. It is kind of bizarre. Imagine people walking around in hazmat suits if they're scared of COVID or if they really are in need of you can stay at home and not wear the hazmat suit. You can go out in public, you put your hazmat suit on, you're protected. So it is bizarre. Of course it's bizarre. But then again, compared to what? Compared to lockdowns? I don't think there's anything wearing hazmat suits is nowhere near as bizarre as Times Square being empty. Nowhere near as bizarre as destroying supply lines as we've done. Having, again, kindergartners try to learn through Zoom. The Canadian government actually advised in a serious directive, I'm not sure what it's called. Canadian government in July of 2020 sent out very helpful advice that people who don't live in the same household as each other but who are having sex with each other should wear masks. That's really bizarre. We're living in a world in which governments are completely upending the way human life proceeds. People are prevented from burying their loved ones. They're prevented from going to graduation. They're prevented from going to schools. And so I think hazmat suits in comparison would have been a much better option. Now, I'm not really recommending, of course, hazmat suits. I mean, if you want to wear a hazmat suit, that's fine. Alex sent me an email a few weeks ago. You'll notice I have no PowerPoint presentation. This is kind of an experiment. This is the first time I've given a lecture in several years without a PowerPoint presentation, so you're kind of guinea pigs. It's a throwback to the 1990s. But anyway, Alex sent me an email saying, well, if you have a PowerPoint presentation, send it along. I would only have one picture to put on it. I can show it to you, it's in my cell phone. The first time I flew after COVID was November of 2020. I was flying out to visit some friends in Colorado. I was at Dulles Airport. I kid you not, I'm at the gate, and this person walks up wearing a hazmat suit. So I got the idea. Wearing a hazmat suit. I only learned that it was a young Asian woman because at one point she took off her hazmat suit hat in order to drink some water. And it's a young Asian woman. She's absolutely at no risk from COVID, but she's got a hat. And she got on the plane with the hazmat. Shoes, everything. She's like one of these Chinese, people you see in pictures of China now. Assaulting the residents of Shanghai. And so I want to end on a serious contention here, and that is, so COVID does pose, and it certainly did pose, Omicron and its variant are a little bit less lethal than earlier variants. Natural immunity is a real thing. But it is a serious disease to a fairly large group of people. And the appropriate response to that would have been to focus protection on them. And to say it's impractical, I think, is a cop-out. Hazmat suits would work. Again, I'm not really proposing that, but that would be a better option than the path we chose. Because what I fear is that people 100 years from now will look back, or people in any history in the future, will look back on what happened in the past 2 years. And they'll regard it as what the historian Thomas Cahill calls a hinge of history. I think we had the past 2 years were a historical turning point. I worry that your generation is going to, my generation is going to be gone soon. Your generation is probably going to suffer pretty significantly compared to what life would have been like in the absence of what has happened in the past 2 years. The government has seized enormous amounts of discretionary power, doesn't want to give it back. They've learned that, the governments have learned that if they scare people, using, by the way, a lot of behavioral economics research, the British government basically now admits that it has a nudge unit, as it's colloquially called. And so they intentionally tried to scare people into thinking that COVID was more dangerous than it really is, in order that people would become compliant. And I think that is a kind of scary impracticality, far more impractical, far more dangerous than any of the steps that would have been taken had humanity been more sensible and followed a focused protection or individualized option in dealing with COVID. And so if you detect in my closing remarks deep pessimism about the future, that you detect correctly. I think the precedent has been set for really dystopian horrors, and I've never before hoped that I am wrong as much as I hope that I am wrong now. So I think I'm out of time. I hope you have some questions for me, or some cheery news.
Just one very quick thing. I'm not sure if you were aware or how many of our students are aware, but as of December, Hillsdale College has started it's kind of a subgroup called the Academy of Science and Freedom. Is it Science and Freedom? Freedom of Science.
I think it's Freedom of Science.
Freedom of Science. Have you heard about this?
Mm-mm.
It's actually.
Oh, I have heard about it. Yeah.
It's Boudreaux,
By email, yeah.
Calduff, and Scott Atlas, who worked for Trump and was constantly battling.
They were here, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so they are actually associated with the college now and going out and speaking about these things. And Calduff, I guess he's been severed from Harvard. I guess he's no longer associated with Harvard. Right?
That was his choice. He told me that he was just so appalled and surprised by the treatment that he got from his colleagues. He was tenured. You don't give up a tenured position at Harvard Medical School, because you got indigestion the night before. So it must have been really horrible. And I know Jay Bhattacharya has gotten death threats. There was a petition at Stanford signed by his fellow colleagues at Stanford to have him run off campus or officially censured for doing nothing other than issuing a document that pretty much summarized the public health consensus as it existed in 2019. Something horrible happened to humankind.
So the story I heard, in fact, that Dr. Arnn told me at the New Year's Eve party, he said that he was approached by, I think, Bhattacharya in particular, and said that their brand has taken quite a hit, something along those lines, and that the Hillsdale College brand is always under attack, right? So let's put our two brands together.
I did hear about that, and I applaud that effort greatly. And I know I published on my blog, did the video of Scott Atlas's talk that he gave here a few months ago.
Yeah.
There have been heroes through this. Scott Atlas is one. The three authors of the Great Barrington Declaration are one. I think the people who work for AIER in giving voice to these people who were suddenly dispossessed by the official community. But there haven't been many. for me, one of the most disappointing things was how quiet so many classical liberals were in the face of this. I'm looking at this, and, you know, we all make mistakes. I'm subject to error, of course, probably more than most. And I just see just tyranny just infused in all of these edicts, and crickets from a lot of people. They're shutting down the economy. They're telling people they cannot go to funerals. They're telling people they can't leave their houses. The Australians are arresting people. They're tackling people outside because the mask is below the nose. Right? The Chinese government, it's true, the Chinese government's authoritarian, but they're welding people into their houses in order to stop COVID. And how many people spoke out about it? Very few, more are doing so now. But it's disappointing that there were fewer voices a year and a half ago, or even just a year ago. Well, we got to, you know, it's an externality. It's an externality. I've heard a lot of the comments, it's an externality, so we have to, that's how you deal with externalities. And then that's why I brought up cost. That's not how you deal with externalities. The way you deal with externalities is a lot more sophisticated. You find, to put it in fairly technical language, you find the low cost avoider, and you put the burden on the low cost avoider to deal with the externality. The low cost avoider is clearly the people who are especially vulnerable. It's relatively easy for them to isolate themselves. Again, in the extreme case, put a hazmat suit on. You don't have to be that extreme, but whatever those measures are, they are not as extreme, they're not as costly, they're not as dangerous, they do not set a precedent as horrifying as the one has been set in the past 2 years.
You know about the act, there's, just all along these lines, in mentioning Thaler, somebody had sent me this article, but there's something called the Solomon Ash experiment.
No.
And this says something about why there was the crackdown on the great Barrington authors. But there's this experiment where they put people into a lab and they have, one person is actually the subject and doesn't realize that he is. But they've got half a dozen people and they tell the experimenter comes in and says something that's just absolutely insane that nobody could believe. And first person says, yes, that's right. Second one, yeah, I agree. Third, and they get around finally the test subject who then, if there's everybody else has said yes, he goes on, yeah, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And they say that when they conduct that experiment, if it takes just one or maybe two other people to disagree, that the whole thing falls apart and the guy says, yeah, that's bullshit.
Yeah.
And so the idea of silencing, and somebody's writing about this who was a student of Thaler, talking about how Thaler had been helping design this with that unit, and then Thaler said, it's gone too far, now we have to do mandates and other things and just out and out propaganda about scare tactics because you're not coming along.
Yeah, it shows that the nudge people, there's a shove not far behind the nudge, right? So if the nudge doesn't work, well then let's shove, right? And that's what Thaler was all about.
But that's the whole point of being so important just to try bullshit when you hear bullshit and not to go along.
Yeah. Another aspect of this is, so pay attention to this as you go through your life. How often do you ever hear governments apologize? You'll hear governments apologize, but they always apologize for things they did 200 years ago. Right? So the American government apologizes for slavery. It's very nice, right? The Catholic Church apologizes for what it did to Galileo. Apologizes in the 20th century for what it did to Galileo in the 17th. Galileo probably doesn't care anymore. Governments don't apologize, and governments don't, unlike private actors, reverse themselves. Because I think it's something in the nature of running for office, or presenting yourself as a leader. You're sort of presenting yourself as, you have special knowledge. You're kind of in the position of a god. Right? I'm not joking. That's how people like to think of themselves. I'm the leader. That's why you can trust me with all this power that you wouldn't trust anybody else with. That's why you can trust me with the power to unilaterally wipe you out if I so choose. Or I'm elected. I'm the Vox Populi has declared me as fit to rule over you. And so if you make a mistake, people make mistakes. We're all human. government people make mistakes, but they can't admit mistakes. Right? So what happens in government is they double down. I think they're much more likely to double down on mistakes. In the private sector, you can't double down. If you double down on a mistake, you wind up losing way too much money. None of you remember because none of you were born, but a handful of us here remember in 1985 there was the famous switch of Coca-Cola and New Coke, something called New Coke. And they got Coca-Cola got Bill Cosby to advertise when Bill Cosby was legitimate. Bill Cosby was going to advertise the New Coke, and it was a big campaign. Right? New Coke, New Coke. It was a huge campaign, unbelievable. It's all we heard about was the upcoming New Coke. I think it was like in April of '85, like May or June of '85. Nope, no more New Coke. People don't like it. Coca-Cola just reversed. That's an extreme example. But in the private sector, you make a mistake, you reverse. It's no crime in making a mistake. But in the private sector, people have an incentive to reverse because if they don't, they lose money. In the government sector, you have if you reverse too quickly, you lose reputation. So the incentive is not to reverse. Oh no, we didn't make a mistake. We didn't make a mistake. We didn't lock down hard enough. People didn't wear the mask well enough. This is what you hear. The mask mandates work. It's just that the 2-year-olds, they just didn't wear them correctly, right? Or the people wearing the wrong kinds of masks. Some states with Governor DeSantis, they're distorting the data and the narrative. And so if we only do it the right way, really lock down, really impose the mandate, then we'll get things right. And of course, you can always do it harder. You can always do it longer. And it may be that if you do it harder and you do it longer, that then the promised land of zero COVID will come about. So governments have all the wrong incentives. They have the incentive to double down on their errors in a way that people in the private sector don't have an incentive to double down. They have an incentive to correct their course as soon as they learn that they've made mistakes. Yep.
The Trump administration with the vaccine, they jumped over all these FDA regulations that were there and got the vaccines out like that. It doesn't seem like there was much credit given to the Trump administration for looking at all the barriers that the FDA put in for innovation in vaccines and the like.
Yeah, 2020 was a perfect storm, right? You have a historically unpopular president in an election year with this virus that arises, and so I don't think it was conscious, but I think a lot of people in the press just saw this as an opportunity. Any way to spin this in a way that will help destroy Donald Trump. That was their instinct, was to do that, and so they weren't about to give Trump credit for anything he did that was right. I think, but I don't give Trump credit. I think Trump bears blame for one terrible thing. Trump let Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx. He gave them too much of a platform. Right? The one time he should have shut people up. He should have shut the experts up. He let them talk and talk and talk, and he followed their advice at first. Later on, he started to question it, but then it was too late. He should have fired Anthony Fauci immediately. Deborah Birx never should have been on the scene. These are the two people, more than any others in America, who pressed for lockdowns, and it's just awful. I mean, people are calling, even Kulldorff and Bhattacharya, who I like a lot, but even some people are calling for let's bring the lockdowners to justice and do a kind of like Nuremberg trial, and I think that's a bad idea. First, I mean, there's something I don't like about even if we were victors, I don't like take the losers and because they're losers and run them and persecute them. I think it would set a terrible precedent. But I understand the anger that legitimate scientists had about how they were treated. And Boudreaux and Kildorf were legitimate scientists, and Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx, if they were ever legitimate scientists, they became corrupted. I don't have any doubt by their long time in government office. Anthony Fauci has been a government bureaucrat for what, 42 years? And this is an important point too, but Bhattacharya makes it, maybe others do as well, but it's an important point, I didn't mention it. As in his role, he, along with Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, they are responsible for doling out huge sums of government grants. And if you want to build a reputation as a scientist in the biomedical field, you need to get one of these grants. And so you're not going to, if you're a young scientist, you're not going to contradict what these officials are saying. So this is a big danger of having this kind of resource allocation, decision making housed in the state, housed in government. You know, all sorts of horrors just were at play in this thing. But I have more to say, but yeah.
It'll be the last question.
Yeah. Sorry.
You have a reputation, a good one, of being able to effectively communicate economics to people and just ideas. How do we communicate this to people who are completely unwilling to hear anything? To hear that, oh, I was wrong in forcing my child to mask or vaccinate them as like a 3-year-old. Like, people are completely unwilling to hear anything.
So the word communication itself implies, right, it's a community, right? It implies a willingness of the parties to the communication to listen. If one of those parties is closed-minded, then no matter how effective the communicator is, if your mind is closed, then your mind is closed. Nothing I or anyone else can say to change your mind. You just steel trap shut. It's not going to work. And that's unfortunate. I think that in the case of COVID, it did become a kind of religious zealotry. There are the people who believe that COVID is it's the doomsday meteor, and unless we completely wipe it out, we're all going to die soon. I know we're at the end. I'll tell you one story that just arose today. It's very sad. I was very happy to be at the airport today, not having to wear a mask. No, it's glorious. I felt liberated. Who knew you'd feel good not being able to breathe unobstructed? I get to the Detroit airport. I rent a car. I get in the national van to take me from the airport terminal to the rental car lot. It's crowded. No one on the van has masks on. No one. The last 2 people who jump on have masks on. It's a father and his young daughter. They have masks on. The guy looks like he's in his early to mid 30s. Very cute young girl. She had curly red hair. The door was set right across from me. And she's looking around. She takes her mask off. Her father puts it right back on. And she says, "Daddy, none of these people have masks on. I don't want to wear my mask." And he said, well, I can't remember a name I couldn't make out. "I don't want you to die." I'm thinking, what's in this guy's head? And what is this child learning? She's going to die if she doesn't keep this thing over her face. It's just very, very sad. So, anyway, thank you all.
Thank you.